very warm welcome to Infrastructure Week. Welcome back. This is the Thursday rendition where we discuss building green spaces and transforming energy. I think it is important to consider these sectors of infrastructure as interconnected in the evolution towards a carbon neutral society. As part of today's session, we have Lisa. I am so sorry.
Ciecko.
Plant ecologist with Seattle Parks and Rec, talking about Green Seattle Partnership, an awesome program here. Matthew Combe, Executive Director of Seattle 2030 Jurisdiction, joined by Ellen Southard, Stormwater Program Manager, who will discuss climate resiliency around the Sound. And finally, Annika Wallendahl, Principal Engineer with SLR International, providing an update on CETA, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, and other important energy legislation. This event is part of United for Infrastructure, a nationwide movement driving infrastructure investment. We host our local event to serve as a platform for professional stewardship, public awareness, and community engagement to accelerate transformative ecological change in the infrastructure evolution. I'm Robert Hanlon, founder of Utility Squared, where we connect communities to their infrastructure engineering solutions with our fellow neighbors as stakeholders. I've gone over this definition enough this week, so in the sake of time, infrastructure is big. It's much larger than what we typically think of. There's 16 critical sectors. We often like to think as the places we live, work, shop, and eat, housing, apartments, sports, music, and the best of all here are green spaces so that we have healthy urban ecosystems. The core value here behind Infrastructure Week is that communities should be at the center of infrastructure. But just like remembering to turn off your lights or cope with a moderate thermostat setting in an effort to reduce energy consumption, adding stakeholders to large infrastructure projects can be a challenge. However, where and how we generate electricity shapes the city and health of its people for generations. So let's think about this infrastructure legacy as a design criteria and elevate community and environment as primary stakeholders. And when discussing infrastructure, I refer to the human era, explaining how humans have been living within the built environment for over 12,000 years. We have been living within the second generation of infrastructure for a little under 200 years, but have completely disrupted Earth's natural balance in pursuit of modernity. Most notably with what we're covering today, green space and energy, two sectors which are becoming more interconnected and related than we ever thought possible. So what have humans achieved in terms of energy infrastructure? Well, 1752 was Franklin's famous key on kite experiment, the ones we all learned about, but electricity has far-reaching roots, with the first battery dating back 2,000 years ago, around 10,000 in the human era. The Baghdad battery, as it was known, found in Persia in the 1930s, was believed to be used for electroplating or even healing purposes. Around this time, Greek academics noted static electricity and magnetism. Electricity was heavily studied in the 1600s, mostly academic hypotheses, until the 1800s when theories became tangible creations. Samuel Morse invented the electric telegraph in 1844, which was used for centuries. The light bulb was invented in 1878 by Joseph Swan, but really perfected by Thomas Edison out of Cleveland, Ohio. And in 1882, he opened up the Pearl Street Power Station, the first of its kind in New York. By this time, steam power was commonplace, empowering novel textile and steel manufacturing, but electricity quickly became the new wheel, if you will, driving innovation and advancing our species. There's tremendous electrical innovation from the late 1800s. Most famous by the War of the Currents, allegedly started off with $1 million bet won by Tesla, defaulted allegedly by Edison. Ultimately, both AC and DC technologies prevailed, though, just in different ways. Tesla and Westinghouse proved generation and transmission of AC was superior, while DC proved worthy of many applications and, as we know it today, energy storage. With adoption of at-scale electricity came this investor-owned versus publicly owned utility debate, a big deal, and natural monopoly. Essentially, once a local utility sets up all the generation and distribution infrastructure, it's hard for another utility or entity to come in and duplicate or even compete with that system. So how does capitalism keep prices in check? That was part of this massive debate. This barrier to market entry has been in place for, almost a century, over a century, until recent advances in renewables and energy co-ops have started to emerge. And the realm of energy has way too many things to cover in a short presentation, but this list here provides some of the milestones. Most infamous in hindsight was the war waged on regulations really kind of ramping up in the 90s, the idea that environmental stewardship kills jobs. Well, the truth is that energy innovation and environmental regulation has been the largest growing job sectors this century. Our most developed, moving into more closer to the present, our most developed energy infrastructure is arguably natural gas, a fossil fuel pulled from the earth comprised of methane, primarily methane, I should say. This is an incredibly versatile fuel with peak efficiencies found at cogeneration facilities. More importantly, it can be generated via renewable processes, things like we covered yesterday with water and at Trash Tuesday, harnessing the power of bacteria through digestion, anaerobic digestion notably. Even more intriguing here is the idea of organic RNG, produced in a closed loop or circular system by processing food or agricultural waste, producing biogas and compost, then using that compost to grow more plants and thus more fuel, and it actually is carbon negative. One way to produce RNG without bacteria, through digestion, is gasification or pyrolysis, where an organic feedstock is heated in an anaerobic oxygen-free vessel to the point of combustion. However, rather than form CO2 through combustion, a myriad of hydrocarbons is produced using specialized catalysts. Pyrolysis can be tailored for agricultural waste, sorted plastics, and numerous other organic materials. It is not new. It was first adopted by the Germans in World War II to offset the lack of oil they could basically get during the war effort. Now, these are scalable technologies which have been kept at pilot scale as their products are cheaper to extract from the earth than to actually produce. Well, a lot of that's changing. And thinking about that, we have solar, right? But we picture solar panels, most frequently PV. But there are many other ways to capture energy from the sun. It might actually be the most economical way for you to heat and cool your home. And we could leverage concentrated solar power to heat pyrolysis vessels and produce storable fuels. So let's expand our mind when we think of sun energy. We often have wind, tidal, and hydro, which all leverage this kinetic potential energy of fluids to drive a generator and thus produce electricity. However, as we assess limitations, both these, and solar PV may be better suited to actually produce hydrogen. It's found in every compound. It is the atomic weed in every molecular crack. And again, it is not a new fuel. However, recent innovations are making it not only economical, but a feasible solution towards carbon neutrality. This brings us to fuel cells. Essentially batteries, but instead of exhausting a battery's limited chemical reaction potential, fuel cells have a continuous feed, whether that's hydrogen, natural gas, renewable natural gas, and quite frankly, an unlimited other possibilities that can provide instant non-interruptible power. Many commercial facilities are already replacing traditional diesel generators with fuel cells as backup. But getting back to batteries and storage technologies, batteries are in everything. They're in the computer, they're in every device you're logging onto, with capacity and form factor technology improving at unforeseen rates. Possibilities are only limited by our own imagination. But also, they've been limited by patent trolling by big oil throughout the 90s, and of course, Earth's limited accessible resources. So batteries as we know them may not be adequate beyond the consumer level. They simply require excessive resources to meet our energy demand. Given the limitations to solar and wind production times, the idea of storing excess energy as kinetic and potential on grid is gaining traction, basically alternatives to traditional batteries. Things like pumped hydro, stacked blocks, stored or compressed air, and my favorite from racing is Kerr's kinetic energy recovery system, or flywheel energy systems. Massive flywheel powered by and powering a generator. And they could be pivotal in balancing your energy load, your demand and supply in areas that have completely transitioned to PV or wind. Lastly, we need to seriously consider nuclear as a transitionary technology to escape the grasp of carbon-based energy systems. These are not the nukes of olden days, and many people don't realize that the US nuclear tech we use for energy is actually based on the ability to manufacture material for weapons at the same time. These are often much more dangerous and risky than those found in Europe, and the tech being developed at scale in India and China. The US is lagging in nuclear energy innovation. But with public understanding and support, SMRs, or small modular reactors, additive manufacturing, advanced and accident-tolerant fuels can actually pave the way for clean nuclear energy. And let's remember that this is about a green energy portfolio. There's no single solution besides changing our own energy habits, and that's unlikely to change. And please stop telling people that wind doesn't always blow and sun doesn't always shine, because we know that. But we also know that gas doesn't always flow. So, did I miss any other forms of energy when I was covering those? Kind of a joke. The transition from fossil fuel dependency is long past due. Earth's natural fluxes to sequester carbon is losing the battle from burning coal and crude products. We were told about acid rain in elementary school, yet coal has been celebrated. You know, we learned about anthropogenic climate change, but instead of climate action, the inconvenient truth was mocked as some liberal conspiracy. We all watched the Deepwater Horizon disaster on TV. Many experienced it, and we heard excuses while millions of Earth's inhabitants died in regional ecological devastation in what was anything but a one-time incident. And far too many communities are suffering traditional energy infrastructure failures. Recently, we had the Porter Ranch gas leak in Aliso Canyon, the Texas outage this winter, and ERCOT's response. Most recently, the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, all proving vulnerabilities. While I'm missing numerous other examples across the nation, the bigger picture is what is important: a global one Earth mentality. Trillions in economic damages and losses have occurred and will continue to occur as carbon levels in our atmosphere increase, with millions dying each year due to inhalation of particulate matter PM 2.5 and 10, resulting from the combustion of fossil fuels. So we have to shed this entrenched belief that a green society is too costly, not reliable, or some part of an elaborate scheme to trick us into taking better care of our home planet, our only planet. This begins with accounting for the cost of carbon to provide holistic, scientifically based approach to energy investment and infrastructure planning. At present, only 11 states use the social cost of carbon in policy proceedings. It's time for federal leadership on this global issue. And part of moving on from fossil fuels must include amends for its blue-collar workforce and opportunities for their community to remain resilient. Quickly run through some facts here. EIA projects 50% increase in global energy usage in the next 30 years, mainly growth in developing countries in Asia. But really, let's look at our percentages. 2017, we had 17% of total consumption, with only 4.25% of the population. Everybody says, well, China and India. Well, China's population is 18.5% of the world. India's is almost 18%, and look at where they rank. More concerning here is our usage. We use almost 4 times the amount of energy per household than the EU on average. We're more energy intensive than any other country that exists in a moderate climate. We've all seen a chart like this here, but more intriguing is the actual overview of consumption, production, imports, and exports. The US is approaching energy independence and an inflection point where we can make a transition to a greener energy portfolio. And, the argument for green energy is really in the details here. A disconnected nature of Generation 2 infrastructure adversely contributes to our energy consumption. Most notably, look at the 65% losses in generation transmission of power using traditional infrastructure. This comprises 24% of our total energy consumption, completely lost to heating the environment and further increasing global temperature rise. So again, Infrastructure Week is here to remind us that the future is up to us as professionals, consumers, neighbors. Think about the extent of impact we've had in the last 200 of our 12,000 years in the human era. What will the next 50, 500, or 5,000 years look like if we choose this extractive status quo over investment towards symbiosis and a greener sense of modernity? Again, it revolves around a reflective versus automatic decision making and shaking a bias against green energy. Without further ado, we are going to transition to building green spaces. Leave it up to Lisa, plant ecologist with Seattle Parks and Rec, talking about their Green Seattle partnership here in the region, an important effort. Let me stop sharing and hand it over to you, Lisa.
Great, thank you. Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Lisa Ciecko. I'm a plant ecologist with Seattle Parks and Recreation, and I specifically work on the Green Seattle Partnership. So I'm going to take us sideways a little bit and be talking about plants and vegetation for the next little bit. But first, I want to start by kind of anchoring us on the landscape. So I don't know how widespread everybody is, but to kind of give you a sense of Seattle, you get really a nice visual of the topography and the landscape here. You've got downtown on the upper right-hand corner, the Duwamish Valley, Duwamish River, Elliott Bay, and then on the left side, the West Duwamish Greenbelt is really dominating the screen. So that's the component of the landscape that I'm going to talk about in a lot of detail today. But I wanted to start here to be able to talk about that tree canopy, how it happens in parklands, how it happens in people's backyards and along streets, and also because I think this is an important view and chance to acknowledge and recognize that this is Coast Salish land, specifically Muckleshoot, Duwamish, and Suquamish. And so I think that acknowledgement in part allows us to really remember and understand that there is a really long history to this land, and that it has changed really rapidly since colonization. So kind of zoom down onto the ground. There are a whole lot of plants screaming for help down in that West Duwamish Greenbelt. With colonization brought invasive species and extractive economies, and really a disconnection between people and these forested spaces. But Green Seattle Partnership has offered the opportunity to kind of rebuild both that cultural connection and also the physical function of these forests. So if you didn't catch that, these are actually little overlapping images. Look at the picture, the tree that's leaning in the back, cottonwood in the far back, and that is in the original picture as well, in that grainy old original picture. That's why I chose to use that one. So back in 2005, Green Seattle Partnership started to do this work, and we've had a ton of success in the way that we've been able to move forward with green space restoration. This work, because for lots of different reasons, and for one, it's a huge opportunity to improve human health and well-being through access to nature in the city, right directly adjacent to where people live. It's also a chance to build wildlife habitat and improve the health of Puget Sound. And through community engagement events and really bringing people to parks and to the land, there's an opportunity to strengthen neighborhood cohesion and relationships. And then really it's an important chance to bring connection for folks to the impacts of climate change and really offer a chance to have a hands-on impact in increasing climate adaptation and resiliency in the city. So in 2018, we celebrated 1 million volunteer hours, and at the same time, right around the same time, also celebrated having installed 1 million plants as part of the Green Seattle Partnership. So we've added more since then, but I think it's a good number to kind of recognize. Often are curious, what is the Green Seattle Partnership? Is it an organization in and of itself? We have a .org website, right? But it's actually a public-private partnership between the City of Seattle, partner organizations, and the broader community to implement this forest restoration work across the city's forested parklands. So the Parks Department, who I work for, is the lead agency in that. It's the land base where the work is happening. But we also have in-house professional crews, as well as 5 additional contracted crews that are offering a lot of significant technical restoration work. We partner with nonprofit organizations and companies to offer a lot of the programming that we accomplish, and I'll talk a lot more in detail about that later. And then really community members come as participants, sometimes as volunteers, and in some cases also as paid participants to our programming, and really are helping implement the work. And this model, the Green Seattle Partnership model, which I said started in 2005, has since been repeated in 15 cities across the Puget Sound region. So it's really, expanded the impact and really serving kind of a population of 1.6 million people, and affecting the green infrastructure, the green spaces, on 13,000 acres. This work is really rooted in the principles of ecological restoration. And I think that first circle is really the priority to kind of highlight there, that you think of restoration, you think of like, okay, a bunch of nerdy ecologists like myself, thinking about plants and ecosystem function, how all the ecosystem players come together. But really, first and foremost, is that element of community engagement, stakeholder engagement, and also acknowledgement and importance of drawing on really different types of knowledge to make the work happen. This work is happening across the globe, and in fact, the UN has designated the next decade, 2021 through 2030, as the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So really recognizing the role of these broader principles and the chance to really address land degradation and find a way out of the hole that we're in, really. And it's great. I probably speaking to the choir here that, there's clear impacts from climate change. We are already experiencing increasing heat events and wildfires, reduced snowpack, heavier rainfall events. On the right-hand side here, I'm also calling out kind of the really physical and visible piece of that's occurring in Seattle's forest and in our region already. Western red cedar, which is just a dominant part of our forests, as well as a sacred species, is declining in health across the region. And research that's come out of the University of Washington suggests that it's probably not going to be fit to live in Seattle in the future, in its future range. We undertook a climate change vulnerability assessment in 2018 to look at how forested natural areas were at risk, and it was really apparent. At least 50% of the areas where we're working had multiple risk factors. The species diversity present, the types, the actual tree species like Western red cedar, underrepresented forest systems, the position on the landscape, kind of the size of those forests, and all are suggesting that we have really high risk to climate change in these spaces. And so continued restoration and continued stewardship is really critical to making these spaces that are going to be able to persevere and provide that carbon sequestration and heat island dissipation, all the elements that we look for in green infrastructure. Without going into too much detail on the slide, a lot of words, I just wanted to call out that with that vulnerability, restoration also offers a really clear response, that we can look to other parts of the West Coast to understand kind of whether or not there's not different species necessarily, but different genetics for those species that we can bring to Seattle and help kind of shift and make our forests more ready to handle increased heat and drought conditions. And it fits into the work that we're already doing. This is my colleague, Michael, and he is doing a great job of demonstrating kind of what we're looking for in the forest that we're building. So we're looking for increasing native canopy cover, and we're really looking to increase conifer and evergreen species in particular. I think folks on the call who are associated with stormwater management, it's like really evident and important reasons to make that shift away from shorter lived deciduous trees to longer lived conifer trees. They do a much better job of capturing stormwater and carbon for that matter. We're also looking for lots of baby trees and diversity in those baby trees because that's our future forest. And you know, in that first image of the ivy dominating the forest floor, we have a lack of regenerating trees in our forests, and in particular conifer trees. We do not have a future forest the way that we're going, and so we really have to build that structure. We're also looking to reduce the herbaceous and woody weed cover throughout our forests, again for that reason, and also increase understory cover and diversity as well. So it's not all about the trees. We're building kind of a full forest structure. And it's really not all about the plants. There's a lot more that goes into it, but just kind of functional element that we can make shifts in is the vegetation. We do the restoration through 4-phase approach. Initial work is that focus on invasive plant removal. Then we do planting work as well as kind of an extended period of establishment. And then really the important part of the screen is the phase 4, which is kind of the forever phase, long-term stewardship and maintenance. Green Seattle Partnership was conceived as a 20-year kind of jolt for Seattle's green spaces, starting in 2005 and ending in 2025. But really, we have to kind of break that idea that we can just do a little bit of stewardship and make a fix. We really have to kind of bring green space into the management and maintenance of the park system, and bring it into kind of the community mindset that it's a space that needs to be stewarded for the long haul, because they were stewarded. They have been stewarded for time immemorial by Indigenous people in this region. And so it's kind of a chance to bring back that relationship with the land. For all those questions that are coming up in your brains about like, oh, but how do I get rid of that invasive plant? We've developed a lot of materials that are available on the Green Seattle Partnership website, and I'll include the website again at the end of the presentation. But just a quick call out that, you know, we've built through the 15 years of the program, really built out how we do this work in this region, and there's a lot of resources available for community members there. I wanted to focus on the fact that this work is happening through the Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative, that environmental history and the environmental movement has really racist roots, and so there has to be a shift in our approach in order to not just look at this as conservation work and again kind of that one-time work, but kind of build out a more cohesive approach. I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit as well in order to make sure that I can get through some of this content. Whoop. Now it's all lost. Okay, so to meet some of the goals of the Race and Social Justice Initiative, we've in the last several years have really shifted our approach from being really a program where volunteers can come to the work and really brought more equity focus into programming. So we've got work with African elders at the Rainier Beach Urban Farm and Wetland with Tilth Alliance, paid programming to engage them in land stewardship. And there's a ton of benefit there, like you being physical and being outdoors. It doesn't take much to understand that offering that programming it's important to offer programming to folks who can't come as volunteers. I also wanted to highlight the fact that we've really focused a lot on the thought of kind of what the green job pipeline can look like. We have school events and programming, as well as paid high school age programming, core programming, so like crew-based work, as well as kind of paid stipend internships that allow folks to really continue to build out their career and make links into longer term positions. I'm going to move through this a little quickly. I did want to pause and just kind of recognize that all of this work fits really closely into the work that Seattle Parks and Recreation does. The motto for parks is healthy people, healthy environment, strong communities, for short, kind of like healthy, healthy, strong. And this is, you know, I think Green Seattle Partnership work really hits all of those elements really closely. So just one last look, kind of bringing us back down to the ground again. This is Westcrest Park in near White Center. And so kind of probably on the edge of that first image that I showed. So we've got just kind of the level of activation that's happening at this park through the program includes pollinator habitat project, poison hemlock control, which is a toxic weed, madrone recovery work, monitoring work, and then also wetland work. And this is just all in like this last year. And it's happening with a lot of hands. We've got 4 stewards that are active there. So our lead volunteers, partner organizations, and our own professional crews as well are all kind of activating this space. And I think it's a really nice look at a way of really maximizing this infrastructure, right? You can think of Westcrest as a place that has a dog park and a reservoir, but really there's a much bigger part of the land that's dominated by forest and offering this a lot of benefit and a chance to build this restoration and restore a relationship with the land. So with that, here is our social media information as well as our website. And if there's time for questions, I can take them, but I'm also happy to stay on a little longer.
That's awesome. I mean, just the stats from Seattle Park and Rec, I mean, they're staggering and impressive. That 96% within a 10-minute walk to a green space, you know, that's awesome. And I know everybody here in South Park appreciates, you know, redoing the Duwamish Waterway Park. It's coming together nicely. My partner and I are really excited for the zip line that they're putting in there.
Oh.
So, one question. Okay, you mentioned, you know, the potential die-off of the red cedar. Can you speak a little bit as to like tree evolution? Is there any way that, you know, our native trees are going to keep up with climate change?
That's a good point. So there's been research that suggests that, you know, the time frame that it takes trees to evolve, the way that they develop and reproduce, does not allow them to do the kind of adaptation work that has to happen in order to be ready for future climate conditions. There is some thought that small shrubs and understory that reproduce more readily and so evolve more readily will be better suited. But there's been other research that doesn't tell that same story. And so, yeah, it'll be really interesting to see in the next 50 years, you know, where we start to see impacts to vegetation and trees in particular.
Mm-hmm. And it almost seems like the problem, you know, could be exacerbated because invasive species often, you know, can flourish more rapidly or, you know, reproduce, right? Does that make sense?
Right. So some of the susceptibility is not just, you know, heat and drought stress, but what that then causes within an organism system. So big leaf maple is an example where we have fully dominated. That's pretty much what our forests are. We have big leaf maple everywhere. And just the increase in temperatures and drought stress means that then they're more susceptible to insect pests and pathogens. And we're seeing that rapid increase in failure of big leaf maple.
Yeah, it's interesting. In 2019, I did a lot of traveling, and the increased prevalence of pests is a North American problem. I mean, and that's just my experience, but I imagine that this is a global thing, right? We stress the plants, pests are going to thrive, and now we have more wildfires because.
Yep. And there wasn't enough wildfires. I think that's definitely part of the story too, is that use of fire and fire management has impacted forest health for the last century, and kind of really breaking that stewardship role that has been played across the landscape for time immemorial. Breaking that relationship and dynamic has had a lasting impact. Our transportation systems, our utility corridors are also really changing structure and in offering a place where pests can move more freely. So there's kind of a role, in forest health from a lot of different angles.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and Seattle Parks and Rec and Green Seattle Partnership for all that you do. And community members, get out, volunteer, help keep our green spaces thriving and healthy. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew at Seattle 2030 districts. You should be able to present, and I know Ellen is on the call as well. And Ellen, you are now a co-host, so.
Yeah, I think I'm going to drive everything, so it should just be me, and then Ellen can jump in and talk when she's ready. So thanks, Rob, and thanks for having us here at Infrastructure Week, and welcome to everyone on the call. So we're going to present today on climate resiliency around the Sound for Infrastructure Week. So as Rob said, my name is Matthew Combe. I'm the Executive Director of the Seattle 2030 District, and I'm joined today by Ellen Southard, who's our Stormwater Program Manager and Strategic Partner. And this afternoon, we're just going to give a quick introduction to the Seattle 2030 District. I'm going to give an overview of some of the challenges to achieving net zero here in Seattle, and then Ellen's going to go through some of the work that we're doing around green infrastructure. So the Seattle 2030 District is an organization, and we're committed to transforming the city by significantly reducing the environmental impacts of buildings by the year 2030. And we're doing this because without transformative change in the buildings where we live, work, and play, then we will lose the climate battle here in the Pacific Northwest. So we're a private-public partnership. And the main reason I say that is I think it's important that we're private sector led, because in the past we've seen that public sector programs, specifically around the environment, can lag out or even fail when there's a change in administration. So by working with the private sector, we're working to create market-based solutions to achieve the 2030 district goals. And those goals are really to achieve a 50% reduction in energy, water, and transportation emissions by the year 2030, with interim goals in between that. And that goal is a district-wide goal. And then for new construction, a little bit different, but we're really aiming to get to carbon neutral buildings by the year 2030, again, with interim goals in between that. And the goal for water and transportation emissions is 50% reduction again. If you're looking for kind of a comparison of what that looks like related to today's energy code, it's probably around like a 50 to 20% better than energy code to achieve that 80% reduction. So we have a shared mission, like I said, to achieve the 2030 district goals throughout the kind of the downtown region of Seattle. And really, that's the reason why a lot of our building owners and managers signed up originally, is because it's not that individual building goal. So you're kind of sharing the responsibility amongst everyone, every building owner downtown. So you commit to achieving the best that you can towards that 50% goal. Ideally, if you're a newer building, you might be able to go above that 50% goal. But if you're an older building, particularly kind of the historic ones, you might only be able to achieve maybe a 30% reduction. But on average, we're going to get the whole of the district to that 50% goal, which puts us on that path to climate stabilization. So I've mentioned that we work in downtown Seattle. This is the map of where we work. It's really the downtown core and the surrounding neighborhoods. We have 260 member buildings committed to the 2030 district goals right now. That's around about 60 million square feet. There's no real landmarks on this map, so hopefully you're familiar with Seattle. But you'll see from the bottom here, it kind of goes from the Starbucks Center in SoDo up to Lake Union. Hopefully you all know where that is. And then it goes from the waterfront up to Capitol Hill, First Hill. That kind of tail on the bottom in First Hill is where the Bullitt Center is. So we really try to encompass the large areas around that. And we also have an MOU with the Capitol Hill Eco District, another great organization doing great work around the environment. And we try and work together to achieve mutually beneficial goals. So what do we actually do for our members? Why should you be involved? Well, we do several things. So we convene business leaders and government officials to really try and create policies and incentives that work for both parties to achieve their goals and then also the 2030 district goals. So the City of Seattle has a great climate action plan that we feel we can help work with our members to achieve those goals. We provide education sessions. So recently we've been doing these obviously virtually because of the world that we're living in right now. But we're trying to convene property owners and managers and showcase new strategies that will get them to achieve the 2030 district goals. And more recently, we've been concentrating on how to reopen buildings with occupant health in mind while also improving the building efficiency. We provide demonstration projects with new technologies, so similar to the education sessions. We have a lot of members that are doing great things. So we try and showcase that, and we're also trying to bring innovative products to market quicker by demonstrating that they work in properties. We do a lot of advocacy work. We advocate for new policies and incentives. Obviously, these are pretty ambitious goals that we have for the district, so we need to try and create policies that will help members get there rather than regulations that are going to force people. And then we facilitate a lot of conversation amongst building owners to share information. So one thing that building owners really agreed on when they joined the 2030 district was that they compete on everything to do with their building, right? Whether that's kind of what your rent is, what your building amenities are, but you don't really need to compete on climate change. And you can share information on how you've achieved those goals. So we provide really a safe space for them to share that knowledge. And then lastly, we celebrate our members' achievements. So I've mentioned case studies, so we showcase a lot of that on our website, and then we have our annual Vision Awards every year, where we give out 4 awards to members who showcased exemplary buildings in energy, water, transportation, and overall leadership. And this year that is going to be on October 7th. And keeping my fingers crossed, touching all the wood, doing all the superstitious things, that is going to be in person. So a little bit kind of following on from kind of what Rob was saying. So the importance of the work that we're doing. So the IPCC report that came out a couple of years ago now really shows that we need to get to net zero emissions by the year 2050. And to do that, it's really essential that we hit this 50% reduction in the next 8 years and 8 months. And the longer that we take to achieve that 50% reduction, then the more extreme the time to get to net zero becomes, right? So you can kind of see from this graph that if we achieve a lesser reduction by the year 2030, we have to hit net zero by 2040. So the quicker that we get to this 50%, the better. And just by achieving that, that only gives us a 50% chance of achieving this 1.5 degree temperature change. So buildings really generate about 40% of the emissions, kind of global emissions. So the work that we're all doing really has a direct impact on whether or not we're going to win this battle against the climate change, against the climate crisis. So with that in mind, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we have here in Seattle in reaching net zero. So we have about 900 billion square feet of buildings that will need to be built or renovated globally over the next 15 years. So a huge amount of building stock that needs to be renovated. And we're currently at a renovation rate of around about 1% a year. So really that needs to jump to around 3 to 5% a year to really have a chance of hitting any of these goals. So what are the incentives going to be that we can get building owners, building managers to really undergo some of these major renovations that's going to be required? Or is it kind of going to be more regulation that pushes the market to achieve it? Are we kind of beyond the point of incentives and it's really going to be the federal or local governments kind of giving the stick more than the carrot? So particularly a huge challenge for us here in Seattle. So the most recent energy code that just passed here really takes care of a lot of the new construction work that we have and kind of gets us closer to our goals of the 2030 district, but we still probably have about 70% of our building stock then that needs to be improved for us to meet the 2030 district goals, for the city to meet their climate action goals, and then also just for us to kind of reach anywhere near the Paris climate goals. So how are we going to kind of work to achieve that, and what are the things that we can do as a district to help that along and kind of move the needle to a degree? And then on a similar note, when these buildings are being renovated, how do we ensure that they're being electrified? So the more buildings that we have that come online that are either new construction buildings or go through these major renovations or really just upgrade equipment in the next few years that are using fossil gas is really going to add to our climate change problem. So we need to be making sure that those buildings are using electricity for their heating, hot water, their cooking. Induction stoves have really come a long way in the last few years. If you can get a hold of one, it's part of the challenge, personal challenge that I'm having at the moment. So doing those things and then also ensuring that we're developing in the most energy efficient way as well. And if we can do that, or by not doing that, I should say, it makes the next step even more difficult. So once we've electrified those buildings, we then need to make sure that we have the renewable infrastructure set up to supply these buildings with the energy that they need. So buildings in dense cities like Seattle, you can see from the picture here, have very limited roof capacity for solar, particularly kind of limited by where the technology is right now, right? It's very horizontal. We haven't quite gotten to vertical yet. So with that limited capacity, we really need to be able to bring in off-site renewables into downtown Seattle. And in order for that to happen, we need a grid that supports it. So Seattle City Light is starting to work on this, but ultimately we're going to need all the utilities to be using renewables to power their grids. And that kind of then gets to, we need all of these things to happen together, right? It's not going to be a battle of efficiency versus renewables. It needs to happen kind of lock and step, and both of those things can happen at the same time with the right planning and with the right people at the table. And that will allow us to make these necessary steps quickly and ultimately get us to our climate goals. So that's it for my part. I'm going to hand this over to Alan to talk a little bit about green stormwater infrastructure.
Thanks, Matthew, and thanks to everyone who's here. So Robert had asked us to talk about challenges, and so I'm going to talk about challenges, but I also want to talk about some of the good news as a result of those challenges and how things have changed. And what I wanted to start with was some of the work that we've been doing on stormwater that's been funded by Boeing. And I would encourage you to take a look at this, Harnessing the Rain for Building Performance. It's on our website. My predecessor, Stephen Fry, did the heavy lifting on this. But we looked at a lot of strategies and had some pilot projects and even had a competition around harnessing the rain. So it's a great report, and our communications manager is actually with us today, and she just popped a link to it in the chat for us. But you know, up until now, there's been a lot of legalities and challenges around rainwater reuse and different ways of harvesting and how you reuse it. And so this year, House Bill 1184 passed, which is really the good news. And what it means is it's now a risk-based framework for rainwater reuse, both for gray water purposes. But the idea is to preserve potable water. And so folks might want to take a look at that at House Bill 1184. But it's really going to advance the potential for all types of building typologies to reuse rainwater and to reuse their gray water. Also, part of that work with Boeing, next slide is good, Matthew. There you go, thanks. Part of that work with Boeing, we looked at really, so what are these challenges? How do we get to our commitment of 50% baselines, and how do we help create a tool? So just in general, if you think about the pollution that's running into Seattle, we use this number in terms of the daily pollutant runoff, but cumulatively over the course of the year, it's equivalent to the Exxon Valdez spill. And so that's pretty dramatic when you think about that kind of load, imputed sound, and those kinds of impacts on marine life. And so, and again, and these numbers have changed a little bit over time, but the news hasn't gotten any better where our CSOs are concerned. As a matter of fact, the West Point treatment plant is the third largest treatment plant in the country. It needs a major facelift and a lot of investment. And so we still have this issue of about 150 events every year going to our CSOs. And that is because our stormwater is, with climate change, is coming on harder and stronger, and our storm capacity overflows to the CSOs. So it's really a challenge that is only going to get worse if we can't change that. And so green stormwater infrastructure and the goals that we've set at the 2030 district, we're really trying to help that aspect out. And then actually when it comes to West Point, that is where our water flows from the district. So, and again, we've set this goal of reducing the potable water demand as well, and the stormwater runoff by 50%. So those are our baselines, and that's an accumulative baseline across the district. Next slide, please. So in the course of that work that we did with Boeing, we did create a tool with Earth Economics, and it's a water reuse calculator. So you can actually get data about your buildings from this calculator. Actually, I guess we could go into the next slide. It really helps landowners or building owners think about their return on investment and what kinds of strategies are the most logical strategies for rainwater reuse. And so with the calculator, you plug in your rates, you plug in your building typology, your use, and you start to come up not only with what your impact is, but also, you know, a list of ideas of what could be the best strategies for rainwater capture within your building and what the return of investment could be. We are, if anyone's interested, we are looking for some help with this in terms of we'd really like to collect some data. The way it was structured was that it is private, but we are looking for our members and others that might want to calculate what their impacts are to join us in sharing that data. So we'd like to have a sampling of projects if anyone's interested. You can get back to me about that. But this is a very helpful tool in looking at stormwater reuse for your structure. Next slide. So one of the challenges, you know, Matthew mentioned historic buildings. One of the challenges in our district are buildings that don't require stormwater implementation because they have been around for a while, or they have constraints in terms of their building typology. And so we are now looking at a pilot project funded by Watershed 8, which is one of the water resource inventory areas of the state. We actually happen to sit in 2 RIAs, so this is only for the northern end. So from Belltown north to South Lake Union, and then west to Elliott Bay, and to as far north as Smith Cove. But the idea would be, let's say you had a project similar to the building downtown that Patagonia resides in. And I will say that Patagonia does not own their building. But let's say you were a property owner that wanted to get engaged in Puget Sound recovery, but had the type of structure that really couldn't couldn't meet some of the GSI requirements of the district. So in the case of the Patagonia building, I actually did evaluate this building with Patagonia. They do not have the structural capacity for a green roof at the building. It's a masonry building. They are downtown in Belltown. They have a wider street and sidewalk, and SDOT does not want them to install rain gardens and to take up any more of the sidewalk. They feel that it's really important to keep that width. And then they have a very narrow entryway for their parking garage underground. It's quite small and low-hanging ceilings, so they can't really get a cistern into that building. So if you were this type of property owner, you could work with the Seattle 2030 district to make a stormwater commitment. We would actually use the calculator to look at the impacts of that property and come up with a mitigation plan and a mitigation fee, an offset fee, and we'll be working in the upper watershed in areas that are really needed for salmon recovery. So our partner in this will be Mid-Sound Fisheries, and we're going to initially be working up in Redmond, Woodinville area to do restoration, riparian restoration for water quality and salmon habitat in the upper watershed. Long-term goal would be that we could create some of those types of projects within our district itself. But for now, we had willing landowners in the upper watershed that had already agreed to be doing these mitigation projects, so we can help fund them through this offset fund. And again, if you know anyone with this type of project or that would be interested in working with us on an offset pilot, please, again, see me, and we'd love to hear from you. Next. So one of the challenges that we've identified also in terms of stormwater is that a lot of the incentives don't really prioritize stormwater. And in the case of the green factor in Seattle and many of the other permitting incentives, green permitting incentives around our region, they're focused on buildings and they're focused on the LEED rating system. Not to say that LEED is bad by any means. You know, there's a lot of value to LEED, But the problem is that you can get a pretty high score for your lead project without having a major commitment to stormwater management. And so it really presents a challenge because the incentives are focused on buildings and not sites. They're focused again on individual buildings and not really looking at a larger scale partnership or commitment. And so that has really held back in many ways progress around stormwater in our region. And we hope that the city starts to take a stronger look at this as they move forward. But there is one city that has done just that, and they are really leading by example, and that's the city of Shoreline. Next slide, please. So with Shoreline, they really walked the walk and talked the talk. In 2018, they became a Salmon Safe certified city, and then they also built into their deep green incentives, incentives for site development and stormwater management. So the way it works is they partner different rating systems together. So let's say you're doing passive house, you would then, in order to get the incentive, which is typically 50 to 75% off of your permitting fee or expedited permitting, you would then make passive house, say with Salmon Safe. Or if you're doing LEED, you're required to do the stormwater points within the LEED system, and so on. So they really looked at, with the highest, actually, the highest rating being the Living Building Challenge, and working with ILFI, they came up with that as their priority incentive. But they also have the Built Green Emerald incentive, like I said, Passive House, Salmon Safe, and Built Green 5-star. So where Built Green 5-star and Built Green Emerald is concerned, again, you have to do stormwater management, and you can't just accumulate your points based on healthy materials, air quality, and energy. You really do have to address water conservation as well as stormwater management. So it's a great system. I highly recommend people taking a look at their Deep Green Incentive Program, because it's really the best model in our region in terms of moving the dial. And I think now, so they're 3 years in, and I believe I read that they had 150,000 housing units when you consider the multifamily approach to the Built Green program. So they are taking off like wildfire there. Next slide. And then just want to mention, I think that really the next big move is to, decompartmentalize how we address water, and the One Water philosophy. This graphic is from Jacobs Engineering. They've really gotten behind that. But One Water meaning that no potable water or potable water only for potable uses, and really taking a stronger look at water as a resource, and then also integrated systems. So if you're building a new project, how you can build and take advantage of existing infrastructure for water reuse and wastewater as well. And I think it's going to lead to decentralized wastewater systems, at least maybe in districts or large scale campuses. But the idea really is to take a holistic look at water as a resource, manage it sustainably, and no longer be using fresh water for things like toilet flushing and landscaping and irrigation. It just doesn't make sense. And also looking at gray water reuse for laundry, and very much like, I don't know how many folks might be aware of the Z-Home project up at Issaquah Highlands, but it was the first in the country. It's still one of the highest performing projects. It reached net zero energy immediately, but they have reduced their use of potable water by 70%, and nearly all of their water is recycled. So it's a great case study in our region to look at. Actually, I apologize. I wish I put an image of it in the PowerPoint. But I think One Water is really the way to go. The city of Vancouver is looking at it for future developments. The city of Combe up in British Columbia is also doing a One Water study and looking at their existing infrastructure and how they might reuse it. We do have some recycled water utility here in the county coming from Renton and Redmond. Well, or I should say Brightwater. And that will be reusing some existing line for the purple pipe. But it's been very slow in its takeoff. It's probably been more popular in terms of golf courses and water use for construction sites. They have a fill station in Redmond, but it's been slow in coming in terms of hooking up landowners, especially commercial landowners, to the purple pipe. But we do have the capacity in the north and south end of the county to be doing that work. So with that, just want to thank you for joining us today and open things up for questions.
Awesome. I actually do have a question with Seattle 2030 district. And again, you know, Stephen presented at our very first infrastructure week in Seattle, which was awesome. What city is leading right now? And maybe, you know, if you have that information, what city per capita kind of has like the worst emissions, you know, per building, if you will? I guess, where does Seattle fall here?
Yeah, I don't have the answer to the second one. That's an interesting question, though. We should probably look at it, even if it somewhat shames the city. Maybe that's a good thing. The city that's probably leading at the moment, so there are 20 districts across North America. I would probably say Pittsburgh is probably the leading city at the moment. They have the largest participation. And they're run under the Green Building Alliance, I think. So they've got a kind of a larger organization behind them that certainly helps with the outreach side of things.
Mm-hmm. Nice. That's pretty awesome to hear, especially like coming from such a like industrial, post-industrial city, you know, taking those steps. Yeah. You know, and in terms of, you know, if we're taking a building that's heated or you know, the services that include natural gas, trying to move to complete electrification. Like you said, it's a huge remodel. Anybody looking at RNG or doing, you know, on-site composting to help supplement their heating needs, things like that?
Yeah, it's certainly something, or other alternatives that we've been looking at. I think we've done a couple of sessions now on building electrification or just what the future of Seattle looks like. And RNG has certainly come up. I think it only works really in limited amount of buildings. Like not every building is going to have the space to put one of those systems into their building, which is a similar challenge for stormwater, right? Not every building has the capacity to put in large cisterns. Another interesting thing that's coming out at the moment is waste heat recovery. And King County just started their pilot program around waste heat recovery. So just tapping into the sewage pipes that are already there to heat and cool your building. So I think we'll start to see a little bit more of that. But really on-site, I think off-site renewables is going to be kind of the big thing that drives things forward in the next few years.
Well, quick plug for Impact Bioenergy. You know, the systems do, you know, depending on the capacity, but we're talking a few parking spaces and we can have supplemental heating, you know, from food waste. So buildings that have cafeterias or, you know, large sources of on-site organic production, you know,
Yeah,
a lot of cool solutions coming out.
I'm actually trying to introduce them to a bison ranch that I know at the moment in Montana, because I think it would be a good utility out there.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Well, keep up the good work. And like you said, it's as important right now to be working with those private stakeholders and leveraging, upcoming policy. And here to talk about that policy piece is Annika from SLR International. You have presentation presenter roles now. So when you're ready.
Okay, let me upload my presentation. There we go. Can everybody see that? And is it just one main screen, or are the little screens on the side as well?
Try hitting the presentation. There you go. We're good.
Okay. All right, thanks for hanging around to talk about regulations. Too bad we don't have some beer to spice things up this year, but so what I'm going to be talking about is greenhouse gases and infrastructure and what's going on in Washington State. So between the CETA Act, the GAP rule, Senate Bill 5126 and House Bill 1091, there's a lot of new regulations that affect greenhouse gas emissions that are coming into play. So just as an overview, the whole point of these regulations is how is Washington State going to get from here to there? So right now we're over 100 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions each year, or CO2 equivalents. And the goal is by 2050 to reduce to 95% below 1990 levels. So get down to about 5 million metric tons. So that's a lot of work that we have ahead of us. If you want to read more about that, Washington State Department of Ecology has a great greenhouse gas website on where we're headed. So for this presentation, I'm going to talk about the Clean Energy Transformation Act, or CETA Act, the newly passed Senate Bill 5126, which is called Cap and Invest, House Bill 1091, the Clean Fuels Bill. Both of those two bills were passed just in April 2021. And then the ongoing greenhouse gas assessment for projects, or GAP rule. So first, the Clean Energy Transformation Act. So that was passed in 2019. This regulation primarily affects utilities. It is a follow-on from the Energy Independence Act, or I-937, that was passed here in Washington State. So the EIA established a renewable portfolio standards with targets of renewable energy. So in 2012, that was 3%. And then by 2020, the portfolio target was 15% renewable energy. So CETA builds on that. And the goal with CETA is by 2030 to be 100% greenhouse gas neutral with offsets. And then by 2045, 100% of the electricity is non-emitting and renewable energy, and there's no offsets allowed. There was a really cool Washington State Energy Strategy Decarbonization Modeling Report that came out in December 2020. So if you like graphs and you want to know more about how the modeling looks, what the balance of these renewable energy resources are, how we're going to import or export energy beyond the state boundaries, they did a great job of making that really visual in that report. So there's a link to that. So under CETA, there's specific definitions of what counts as renewable energy. So there's certain types of water, wind, solar, geothermal, renewable natural gas, RNG, renewable hydrogen, wave ocean or tidal power, biodiesel fuel, and biomass energy. So those are the renewable energy resources that are going to help us get to where we need to be in 2045. There's also two types of non-emitting energy resources that's also going to help us reach that goal. So that's hydroelectric and that's nuclear. So under CETA, hydroelectric doesn't count as renewable. It counts as a non-emitting energy resource. And as As you know, we were talking in the beginning of this session about nuclear. There are several companies. I know there's one in Bellevue called TerraPower that's working with different types of sodium reactors and technology that's based not on the type of nuclear power that is associated with weapons, but different types and smaller scale as well. So you could visit their website to check it out if you're interested on small scale nuclear. I don't know what projects, are being, what nuclear projects are planned for Washington. I haven't heard anything like that, but it's interesting technology that puts nuclear in a light that you probably don't think of off the top of your head. So CETA also has a program for renewable energy credits. So there is a renewable energy credit tracking system that's associated with this, and that's called the Western Renewable Energy Generation Information System. So one REC is equal to 1 megawatt hour of renewable generation. And the way this works is similar to bank accounts. You can put REC certificates in, and then you can transfer them or retire them. But we have a carbon management group here at SLR that works with there's many different systems in many different states, and then we do work overseas as well. And so there's lots of different systems, and Washington has a very specific one. And credits generated in Washington. There's also riders for where is the renewable energy credit generated from, under CETA. That's important. So CETA is ongoing and developing right now, and one of the issues that's top of mind right now, and written comments are due by May 31st, is how should energy storage accounting issues be handled under this? So energy storage includes pump storage, hydro, as well as battery, and the different accounting systems and how credits should be associated with those systems is under review. And so if you have an interest in that and you have an opinion on how that should be handled, you still have a couple weeks to get your thoughts in during this continued kind of rulemaking and development of the Act. So the Climate Commitment Act is Senate Bill 5126. So that was passed last month. It's also called Cap and Invest, or carbon pricing. So the goal is to reduce the 2018 levels of Washington greenhouse gas emissions, which were about 100 million metric tons, and bring that to net zero by 2050. And Cap and Invest focuses on the state's largest 100 emitters of greenhouse gases. So these are the facilities and entities that emit more than 25,000 metric tons of greenhouse gas annually. So this bill was backed by a coalition of different environmental groups and corporations and some tribal governments. It did have, it's come around in different forms, but now it's passed. And the Cap and Invest legislation is set to take effect in 2023. But on Monday, when we talked about transportation, and Roger Miller was part of the session and talked about WSDOT funding, Cap and Invest, it's tied to that our legislature passes a statewide transportation spending package to pay for the roads, highways, and other projects through taxing and bonds. So, with fossil fuel decrease and, gasoline and fuel tax money that wouldn't be generated, we need to offset that revenue to support our roads and highways and infrastructures in another way. This graphic is from a recent Seattle Times article. I've given the citation at the bottom, but it's just a visual representation of how far we have to go to reach the 2050 target under SB 5126. Okay, so I'm whipping pretty fast through these. I'll try to remember to take a breath, but we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So House Bill 1091 is the Clean Fuels Bill. So right now, about 45% of greenhouse gas emissions in Washington comes from the transportation sector. So the Clean Fuels Bill really hones in on that and aims to limit the aggregate overall greenhouse gas emission per unit of transportation fuel energy. So that's the carbon intensity, if you will, of a gallon of fuel to, move a vehicle down the road. So reduce the greenhouse gas emissions per that unit of transportation fuel to 10% below 2017 by 2028 and 20% below by 2035. And so the way to go about that is using eligible biofuels, renewable natural gas, hydrogen, and agriculture and forest waste. These are all envisioned to be some of the alternative fuels that can be used to comply with the program to meet the needs of the transportation sector. So the Clean Fuels program is also scheduled to begin in 2023, provided that a transportation spending package gets approved by then. And then I bolded renewable natural gas because it's come up quite a bit, and I just wanted to just take a minute, take a little sidebar to just talk about what it is. So renewable natural gas is biogas that's made from organic sources through anaerobic processes. So it could be generated at a landfill, it could be generated in an anaerobic digester. But when it's produced, it only has about 45 to 65% methane by concentration. And so this biogas is then treated to remove particulates, contaminants, moisture, and then this will increase the methane content to 90% or greater. And if it's really pure, 96, 98% or higher, then it can be actually injected into the pipeline and used as natural gas. And so that's how you end up with renewable natural gas. The first time I heard that term, I thought it was an oxymoron, right? But you can generate natural gas through anaerobic processes, and that's how it becomes a renewable fuel. And so finally, the fourth piece of legislation that I'm talking about today is the greenhouse gas assessment for projects. So the purpose of this regulation is to look at and mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from projects or modification from new projects or modification to existing projects that would cause an increase of 10,000 or more metric tons of greenhouse gas per year. So the GAP rule primarily affects industrial and fossil fuel projects. Project applicants will be required as part of this GAP rule to develop a greenhouse gas mitigation plan for their projects. So industrial facilities, power plants, refineries, food processed waste facilities, these are all just a few of the types of operations that are going to be affected by the GAP rule. And so the Washington State Department of Ecology has been doing stakeholder outreach, has had a lot of virtual presentations over the last year, and they announced just this morning that they've collected comments, informal comments, and they expect to release the draft GAP rule for formal public comment later this summer. And so if that is something that you're interested in, you can get yourself go to the Ecology website, add yourself to the GAP rule listserv, and then you'll get the updates and know when you can submit your comment. There's been a lot of questions around the GAP rule already that have been posed to Ecology, and those comments are documented on the Ecology website, and you can reach the webpage to submit comments and read submitted comments through the Ecology GAP rule website. But a lot of the main questions around the GAP rule is, do you count just direct emissions? Do you count indirect emissions? What can you count in the life cycle of the emissions? Does it, your product? There's a lot of questions that are still up in the air for that. And if you're familiar with the State Environmental Policy Act, the SEPA process, the GAP rule fits into that. It can fit in various stages. But already on the air side, you would be, if you were going through project permitting, you would look at what your greenhouse gas increased emissions would be, but mitigation measures and sort of a more formal process for that is what the GAP rule brings. And so, and there's specific kinds of mitigation and for greenhouse gases, and there's a lot in play. So if this interests you, I encourage you to track what's going on with this rule. So in summary, in order for Washington State to meet its target for 2050, there's a lot of different pieces of legislation that sort of narrow in on different sectors and different types of greenhouse gas emissions. So I think this is a sort of a cheat sheet, whittled down to the very most general terms, but the Clean Energy Transformation Act, it's focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from utilities. Senate Bill 5126, Cap and Invest, that's looking at reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the 100 largest existing emitters. House Bill 1091, the Clean Fuel Bill, this is really targeting reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation fuels. And then the GAP rule for projects, this is focused on reducing or mitigating greenhouse gas emissions from new projects, future projects, or changes to existing facilities that would increase greenhouse gases by 10,000 or more metric tons a year. So these are different pieces. I'm sure there's more legislation coming. It is a big target to reach, but this is an update on 4 of the large ones. And then feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm based here in SLR's Bothell office. We also have a Seattle office. We have a carbon energy and management team, so that actually looks at accounting of low carbon fuels and different RECs and REC systems, and evaluates potential RECs from projects. And then we also have an environmental social governance team that looks at ESG issues and concerns, social aspects of projects, and there's definitely a lot that comes into play with the greenhouse gas regulations in Washington and how that will affect us. I think it's fair to say that no one is safe from the greenhouse gas regulations. It's going to affect us all in one way, shape, or form, whether it's as retail electricity customers or users of transportation, roads, or how we get our products. And so it's we're all moving towards that goal together, but there's a lot that just happened in the last month. So that's it.
Awesome. Would you want to just go back to the other slide as we kind of talk through these? That's an awesome summary.
This one?
So, it's like none of this should come to a surprise. And the fact that this is just Washington kind of speaks to like where we're at as a nation. It's almost as if people just, the last 4 years just vanished, and we aren't going to do anything about climate change. And we've known that this was coming. I wish that these were, done and implemented, refined, of course, and we need public input. What do you gauge as reception when you're working with your clients and whatnot? Do they feel like this is anticipated, or what's overall feels?
I think most clients, so I work mostly on the private industrial side, but SLR does work for utilities, municipal, state, the broad public private. I think every person, every entity that's affected sees the negative first and then the positive, right? They see the costs and then the work that's going to take to get there. But I think, in Washington anyway, there seems to be more an acceptance in general that somehow we need to get to the goal. I think there are other states that are farther along on this process. I know California's had their cap and trade system for quite a while. There's other states that have low carbon fuel standards or are looking at clean fuels. I don't think it's a surprise. I think it's always a surprise when it finally hits and there's a draft rule finally to review. Then people have more specific comments and concerns.
Yeah, 12 states, when I was doing some research for our previous presentation, 12 states are in one way or another part of cap and trade. And I realized, you know, when you in your slides, I forgot to mention geothermal, which is one of my favorites. You know, I mean, it's definitely something we drill down to extract oil and natural gas. And I actually listened to a presentation a while back from an oil and gas exploration firm that shifted to geothermal voluntarily because they see the potential there.
Yeah.
You know, quick question here on, okay, two question, HB 1091. Do we know if there's any, you know, like a loan or grant program to help develop RNG infrastructure, really thinking about, you know, our rural areas and taking advantage of your agricultural waste, your farming waste, you know, to provide not just the form of income, but fulfill those goals?
Yeah, you know, I don't know about specific grants. I don't know if anybody else who's participating in the call has some information they want to share. I you know, it's new. I think I haven't fully wrapped my head around all of it yet, but it's, you know, a lot of the concerns I've seen are about how it will raise the cost of gas in the state and how that disproportionately affects low-income families and workers who have farther to commute. So I've seen that impact discussed with it. I haven't seen the specific numbers of, you know, anticipated costs of, you know, fuel increases. But of course, that's what everyone, you know, we all worry about that. But
And if anybody has any questions, you could raise your hand, hit me up in the chat, or do it in Q&A. You know, I guess one of the things with GAP, one of the means for offset, or I guess, do you know if one of the means for offset would be essentially paying for RNG infrastructure, or, you know, things like we were talking before, you know, like an anaerobic digesting unit, or helping to subsidize others get involved as part of that GHG plan?
yeah, I don't know how the, you know, mitigation credits are going to work. I know that like lots of different programs have fascinating ways that, you know, with wetlands and mitigation credits for that has its own system. So I don't know exactly what it's gonna look like for GAP, but SEPA kind of outlines your options for mitigation and you know, but yeah, it's all developing, and it's interesting.
I kind of mentioned this before, and this goes out to Matt as well. Do we see any form of leveraging blockchain or cryptocurrency in, you know, a positive manner to battle climate change, or, you know, to incentivize? Again, my understanding of crypto is basic, you know, but at least blockchain for accountability and tracking, you know, do we know of anything like that that's in development or out in the wild?
I can't speak to that.
Maybe something to watch out for, you know. It'd be interesting. You never know what's going to come out of the altcoin universe, and it might be you know, some interesting concepts.
There's digital trading cards now that are trading for hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, you know, with
This
digital
is true.
certificates, yeah. So
If we could do that, you know, maybe we could trade carbon credits or some sort of incentivization. It's just, I like that, you know, all of these presentations touch on the idea of, you know, not so much relying on, you know, traditional policy, but a combination of working with the private industry or volunteer work with our communities. You know, I know your role in this transition will continue to be a challenge, but full of opportunity, you know, for innovation and for people to really step up to the plate.
yeah, you know, I don't know if we have any, you know, students who are tuned in now, but, you know, if you are an optimist and you enjoy problem solving and innovation, there's just so much going on with greenhouse gases right now. You know, it's super exciting, and alternative fuels, and it's a pretty cool space to be in.
Well, we went a little bit over time today, but I'm fine with it. You know, we covered a lot and a lot of very important work. I want to thank Lisa, Matthew, Ellen, and Annika for sharing their work, presentations, and really some excellent information. Tomorrow we are rounding out Infrastructure Week. It's the final day, and then you'll have to wait a whole other year for Infrastructure Week, but that doesn't mean you can stop thinking about it. It's all around us. Tomorrow, we're focusing on equitable infrastructure and building sustainable legacies in the urban environment. We'll be joined by the Port of Seattle, and we're going to be playing a recording from Saturday's Youth Panel on Infrastructure segment. A very, very powerful little session we had. Chicago, Washington, D.C., and South Park represented